Good evening. This is Real Progressive. John Lancelot filling in for Stephen Grumbine. He's not feeling well, so I'm filling in on a Saturday night. And we're here with Joseph Firestone. And I'm glad and I'm honored to be on this night tonight. And we're going to bring Joe on. And I just want to say hello, Joe, and how are you today?
I'm great, John. How are you today?
Good, good. Today's a pretty busy Saturday for me, but I'm glad to be here with you tonight. Actually,
Thank you.
I've, reading one of your books, one of the many that you've recommended, because I take this subject of economics very seriously, and of the modern monetary theory and the sovereign monetary system that we all live under, especially with Congress. And I know that the knowledge that you're always dropping on the show is always useful, very useful to the public and very useful to our country, especially in a time where progressives need to start winning elections and getting into Congress and making sure that we can go towards a new deal, a Green New Deal for that matter. So, whatever you have for us tonight, it's going to be very valuable, and, we're ready to go.
Okay, thank you, John.
Got it. So, um, I guess I'll start with a question. MMT, it's something that can be implemented. Both parties choose not to implement it. Theoretically, it could happen. It will happen once it's thought of, but it just seems to go by the wayside. And what we're trying to do is basically bring it to life by putting the right minds in there that are able to actually do it. What have you found in your years of studying economics, and how could we move forward with this?
Okay, well, I'd like to put this in a little different way, okay, if I could.
You may.
We have a fiat currency system right now, which operates according to the MMT description of it. Okay. So MMT at that level is a description, and it applies right now. It's not necessary to implement it. It's there. Okay. Now, what we would want to implement, okay, are progressive policies based in our knowledge of the MMT description of how the economy works. So that's the way that I like to put it. Okay. Now, MMT is, okay, though I think that an argument can be made that it's inherently progressive, insofar as the job guarantee, okay, is at the core, okay, of MMT, and that's certainly a progressive policy. It's probably best to look at it as a body of knowledge that can be used by progressives or conservatives or people, okay, of any label, whatever the ideology they hold. They can make use, okay, of MMT knowledge for their purposes, okay. However, most of the MMT writers themselves, certainly most of the professors, okay, and almost all of the private sector people who work in the financial world, okay, that I've seen so far, okay, and that I've read, seem to be interested in fashioning policies using MMT that are progressive policies. There are only a handful of relatively conservative people who are using MMT knowledge for other purposes. Maybe commentators like John Carney, okay, Ed Harrison, who's a very brilliant economist, tends to operate across the whole spectrum of ideologies. He's not really an ideologue, but he's very well versed, okay, in Austrian economics and neoclassical economics and in MMT as well. and he tends to look at things from from multiple perspectives. Hope that answered the question.
Yes, you did. You answered the question, and you displayed it very well. I'm still navigating through how to implement it. I know we've been dealing with neoliberalism for so long, and it's taken a long time for people to really understand that there is another way to deal with the ills that we have in our world, in our country, in our society. And I'm always learning. I can never know enough.
Yeah, me
And
too.
what did Socrates?
Yeah, that's what it's about,
Yes, I mean Socrates said, "I know nothing," right? So that's a good place to start for intellectuals to start. Basically, I'm very interested in coincidence and how it works with Congress, and what needs to be done within Congress. Let's say we get someone inside the office of senator or the representative that understands and wants to implement MMT in our economy. And how would they go about doing that? Say just one legislature, maybe there's two that could actually try to turn things around. And I've always been interested in how the political system and the economic system mix together and how we can move or change a direction to where we want it to go.
Okay, well, if I can steer this a bit now, what I was wanting to do tonight was to address the question of where the progressive rubber meets the reality road.
Absolutely.
Specifically how, from an MMT point of view, we ought to evaluate the fiscal 2018 budget of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Perhaps we ought to begin by putting the progressive there in quotes, though they would not do that. Okay. But, so let's begin then with the Congressional Progressive Caucus itself, just a summary. The CPC, as it's called, consists of one U.S. Senator and 75 members of the U.S. House of the Representatives, and is the largest caucus within the House Democratic caucus. Now, who do you suppose the lone senator is?
I would say Bernie Sanders.
You're right. You're right. Bernie Sanders was a member of the CPC, one of the founding members, I believe, or maybe he came in a little bit later. I think he came into Congress in 1992. The CPC might have been formed a little bit before that, but certainly he was a very early member of the CPC. And he stayed with it. Well, actually, he came in 93 because he won in 92, then came in 93. Okay, so anyway, when he went into the Senate, he never resigned his membership in the CPC. And so he certainly considered still a valuable member of the caucus, even though most of the members, are from the House. It's strange that no other senators have decided to caucus with the CPC. I suppose they think it's beneath them as senators to do that. Okay, but Bernie never took such a position. Anyway, yes, the caucus was established in 1991. So if I'm correct, it was a bit before Bernie. And it reflects, according to the CPC itself, the diversity and strength of the American people, and seeks to give voice to the needs and aspirations of all Americans, and to build a more just and humane society. So that's the statement of its purpose, their statement, of its purpose, not my statement. Now, the co-chairs the CPC are Representatives Raul M. Grijalva, and he has been a longtime member of the CPC and a longtime co-chair of the CPC for years and years and years. And Keith Ellison, who immediately joined the CPC when he came into Congress and has remained a member since then. And I guess he rose to co-chair in something like 2009 or 2011. Okay, I forget which, but he's been co-chair for a while now also. Okay, so those are the two co-chairs, okay, at this point. The members of the caucus try to promote a strong progressive agenda. They call it the progressive promise, fairness for all. Okay. And their progressive promise is rooted in four core principles that embody national priorities and are consistent with the values, needs, and aspirations of all of the American people, not just the powerful and the privileged. They reflect the fundamental belief in government of the people, by the people, and for the people, according to them. Okay, I mean, that is, quote, according to them. The four core principles of the progressive promise are: one, fighting for economic justice and security for all. I'll tell you, I really hate that one. And the reason why I hate that one is that every politician always says they're fighting for this, or they're fighting for that, or they're fighting for the other thing, but they never seem to get there or to state getting there as a goal. Okay. So I'd like to see him change this one to achieving economic justice and security for all, because we don't really much care about the fighting except as a means to getting there. Okay. The objective is to get there. That should be the core principle. Okay. Then second, protecting and preserving our civil rights and civil liberties. Okay. The third is promoting global peace and security. And the fourth is advancing environmental protection and energy independence. Okay. Again, I'd like to see language connoting the accomplishment of these goals, rather than principles that only talk about the activity, okay, of getting there. Okay, I know much of the joy of life is in the activity, but sometimes you have to get there too, or you're not doing it. Okay, so the CPC members, I'm only going to go through the leadership. The first vice chair is Mark Pocan. Okay, and the other vice chairs are David Chicheline. I'm not sure if that's the right way to pronounce his name. Ruben Gallego, Ro Khanna, the new congressman from California, who seems to be deciding whether he's going to go with the progressive wing of the party, or whether, I mean, the real progressive wing, the Bernie wing of the party, or whether he's going to choose the Clinton wing of the party instead. I don't think he's made up his mind yet, because he seems to be in the process, okay, of doing both.
I agree.
Okay, at this point. Then there's Sheila Jackson Lee, a long-time Congress lady who was extremely promising when she first came into Congress. Okay. And she can be very eloquent. Not as eloquent, okay, as Barbara Jordan before her, but she can be very eloquent from time to time. Okay. Uh, however, I think the fire has gone out of her belly. I don't know exactly when it happened. Okay. But I think that she's a vice chair due to previous attachments to the caucus and not due to current activities on behalf of the caucus. Mm-hmm. Then there's Pramila Jayapal, the new fire eater from Seattle, who was instrumental in the fight for 15 and who seems to be a socialist. I perhaps am presuming too much to call her a socialist, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that particular label, so I think I'm paying her a compliment if I call her a socialist. But anyway, she's very, very well-spoken and extremely bright and a very hard fighter, and I think she has a promising career in Congress ahead of her. But Jamie Raskin, who I believe is Marcus Raskin's son. Okay, Marcus Raskin is an old DC radical, very active in the environmental movement from the beginning. Okay, and Jamie seems to have gotten a family steeping in leftish politics, and he seems to be pretty progressive too. I don't know how much at the state level he was considered very, very progressive, and he gives no indications of loyalty to the Clinton wing of the party. So far, it all seems to be staying with how he got to the Congress in the first place. He entered his race as an underdog, and he got elected as a populist, I think, and I believe he's going to remain a populist. And there's Jan Schakowsky, who long since, it seems to me, bought into the Obama mystique, and who was basically an Obama fellow traveler. She was a member of the Fiscal Commission, also known as the Cat Food Commission, or the National Commission for Fiscal Responsibility, and I forget the title, and Reform. I ought to know it. I wrote about it all the time, but still do sometimes. But so she's been an active member of the CPC for many years now, and when the Fiscal Commission, or as I prefer to call them, the Cat Food Commission, was unable to produce a commission report, and when the co-chairs, Bowles and Simpson, developed their own cat food report and claimed it was the commission report when it never was, there were a number of other reports that were issued by members of the commission. One of those reports was by Jan Schakowsky, and she worked with some of the progressive Washington think tanks in order to develop a progressive fiscal plan. And that plan was very significant because since that time, variations of it have snuck into the CPC budget. She developed it along with the folks at the Economic Policy Institute, okay, or EPI. Okay, and they produced what they thought was a progressive plan. In some ways, okay, it is progressive, but in other ways, it entirely bought into the Petersonian framing which govern the operations of the Fiscal Commission. As I've said on here before, early on, the Cat Food Commission was actually not funded by Congress. In order to get it done, the president had to seek outside funding, and his new friend, Peter G. Peterson, was all too happy to provide the funding which allowed the Cat Food Commission to operate. So, the way the charge of the commission was framed, which, to be honest, was not only Peterson's, but also Obama's, the way it was framed, it was, find us ways of cutting the deficit and reducing the debt to GDP ratio that would achieve bipartisan support in Congress. And so Schakowsky tried to play that game, as did the Republicans on the commission. One of the other members of the commission was Paul Ryan. If I recall, Alice Rivlin was also a member of the commission. And so there were a number of people who issued these reports. The most progressive was Schakowsky's report, okay, that she filed with the assistance, okay, of EPI. Since then, when a lot of other progressive think tanks in Washington want to generate a counter budget to Republican budgets, or even a counter budget to the president's budget, when they don't consider it to be progressive enough, they turn to EPI as the main organization to help them out, because they have the model that produced this Schakowsky report. And we will see that in this year's budget, the people standing behind it from the intellectual point of view and the research point of view are still the EPI people 7 years later, okay, still using the same model that they used back in 2010. So then, okay, another vice chair is Mark Battacano, quite a liberal on many issues, quite a progressive, okay, on many issues, including Medicare for all, okay. A pretty reliable vote for leftish things, okay. I don't think entirely reliable. I think he, as almost everyone else, has sold out on something, okay. Only way to stop that is get rid of them all. But, okay, and then we come to the whip. The CPC has a whip. I've never seen them do any whipping, but the whip's name is Matt Cartwright. I wish they would whip sometimes. I really did.
Are they completely not doing anything when it comes to whipping and trying to get their agenda pushed through, or?
Well, not necessarily as the CPC. For example, in the trade fight, a CPC member, Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, led the anti-TPP forces in the House. And she was able to deliver 7/8 of the House Democrats for the anti-TPP position. And she was almost successful in derailing Fast Track, which would have been really, really nice, because now we have Trump fixing to use Fast Track because it passed and it's still in place. It may be TPP was defeated, but there's Fast Track giving Trump authority to do crazy things in the trade area, which he wouldn't have had if she had been successful. It's interesting to understand why Rosa DeLauro and the Democrats were unsuccessful. I think they failed by something like 4 votes or something like that. It was very, very close vote on the the fast track bill. The person who defeated them, we have to give her full credit for this, I think, was Nancy Pelosi. Because Nancy Pelosi, even though 7/8 of her caucus was against the TPP, refused to use any party discipline on the 28 Democrats, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who defected and who voted against, who voted for the TPA. Okay, that is the Trade Promotion Authority. Okay, so Nancy maintained a studied neutrality until just about the very last day, or the day before the very last day, and then came out with a magnificent speech that, had it been made on the first day and accompanied by party discipline, would probably have beaten the TPA easily. Okay, but on the last day, she came out with it and ended in support, of Rosa DeLauro. Nancy Pelosi has a very fine sense of which way the wind is blowing, and is always looking to maintain her position by maintaining her image as a strong progressive. In fact, she was, until she became the speaker, she was a member of the Progressive Caucus herself. And I believe she was one of the founding members.
I think there's a question from Russell Gallman. He said that Nancy actually did something good, or...
No, Nancy actually defeated the attempt to defeat the TPA by remaining neutral for so long and refusing to attempt to whip the 28 Democrats who wanted to go over to the other side. Okay. It would have been easy for Nancy to swing 10 votes, including hers, over to DeLauro. But she did not do that. It would have been easy. And because there were many Republican defections from the Republican Party on that vote, that is, right-wingers, Freedom Caucus people, who didn't like that trade bill at all, we lacked only 4 votes to defeat it. I think the vote was something like, 217 to 213 or something like that. I forget exactly, but it was a razor-thin margin, and Ryan really had to manipulate things, do parliamentary maneuvers and do all kinds of stretching to get the TPA through the House. It was very, very difficult for him. And he was on the point of being defeated one day. And then he reorganized the order of doing things and pressured people and managed to get some of the Republican defectors to go over to the TPA side, and counted his votes carefully and found that he did have a majority and brought it to the floor at just the right time and got it through. That never would have happened without the neutrality of Nancy Pelosi and her leadership right up to the very last minute. She made no attempt to kick Steny Hoyer in the behind, or any of the others in her leadership. She just, I don't understand how, when 7/8 of your party wants something, you can say you're neutral when you are refusing to commit, in order to please the 1/8. I mean, I can see doing that when there's a split of 55 to 45 or something like that. I mean, that makes sense to me. But when the split is literally 7/8 on the other side, at that point, there's got to be party discipline, or you don't have I mean, you have a mask. That party is just a mask. It isn't. We know who controls Nancy Pelosi, and that neutrality was a result of their control over her. Anyway, so I didn't see Matt Cartwright doing much whipping in that situation.
Right.
But to be fair, maybe he wasn't even the whip then. I forget whether he was, or I mean, he may be newly appointed as the whip.
Right. There's just no whipping going on while they'll.
There's not much whipping going on right now.
Right. Exactly.
Anyway, so there are these annual budget games that go on in Washington. The CBO, of course, has developed a heavy methodology for giving a baseline projection for the federal government, assuming no change in current law. It's a very heavy methodology. I don't know if it's a very good methodology, because I don't believe they can actually project accurately 6 months out, much less than 10 years out, or now they're producing 30-year projections. I mean, those are not worth the electronic bits they're printed on. Okay, I mean, that's for sure. But anyway, so they subject the budgets that come to them at the request of Congress to this baseline analysis and scoring of the budgets for fiscal neutrality. Okay, each program is supposed to be fiscally neutral, and in that way, using that sort of discipline, this is supposed to be a successful, time-honored way. This is supposed to be the essence of fiscal responsibility in Washington, D.C. Actually, it's the essence of the opposite of fiscal irresponsibility in Washington, D.C., because it reflects an erroneous understanding of the meaning of deficits and debts, as we know, okay, from MMT. So CBO is there to do the baselines and the scoring, and they do that. And then they get budgets from the Office of Management and Budget, which is introduced into Congress by members of the President's Party in Congress. Then the House Republicans, since they're now the majority party in the House and have been for some time, each session, they do a budget, and they have CBO do projections. Their budget, of course, incorporates changes to law that they envision. Okay, and CBO dutifully uses its models to score their budgets. And they don't always like this, because they want CBO to do dynamic scoring, which CBO is really not very good at. But also the Republicans don't want real dynamic scoring. They want dynamic scoring that somehow favors their bills rather than objective dynamic scoring. They want certain things to be dynamically scored, but not other things. But that's another long story. Okay. So they're there producing, since 2010, variations of Paul Ryan's budget. He's been putting forward this terrible austerity budget now for years and years and years, with little variations. Okay, it's the thing that got us to the fiscal cliff. Okay, and then of course there had to be a compromise between Paul Ryan, okay, and Patty Murray, and so Democrats, then claimed a victory, but somehow in the middle of this victory, the people lost out. Okay, they lost out further, because there were smaller deficits and smaller expenditures on things people need as a result of this fiscal cliff compromise that they constructed, and that to one degree or another we've been living under ever since. That was back in 2013. It's now 2017, and that compromise is still kind of governing things with, continuation budgets. So each year, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, since then, has come out with its own budget, developed with the collaboration of EPI, and sometimes some other think tanks, in DC, like the CBPP, the Committee for the Budget and Policy Priorities. Jared Bernstein works for them, and there are models there, and they have some input through the EPI people, in some way. And then there's Americans for Tax Justice, or is it Citizens for Tax Justice? I forget. And they do some calculations there, and they have some input into the thing too. And so there are 4 or 5 groups that are having input into the thing, mainly through the EPI model. They're not really separate inputs. And then the CPC works with EPI to come up with a final budget. Now, what I want to do today is to evaluate the CPC budget first from an MMT macroeconomic standpoint, keeping in mind the sectoral balances, which I'll review in a little while. So CPC does a projection of the public debt as a share of GDP. If its budget were enacted for 2018 versus what happens if there were no change. So if current law were retained, what would happen? And you can see in the, well, I guess you can see because I have the graphic there, but I don't have any way to expand up there. But anyway, the projected public debt as a share of GDP under current law, taking into account the years fiscal 2016 to fiscal 2027, starts at about 77% of GDP and increases over the period under current law to 88.9%. Now, of course, any projections that Peterson's group would come up with, for example, would show even worse things happening to the public debt if you consider the public debt to be a bad thing. In other words, they would show even a worse rise with respect to that. But anyway, if the CPC's budget were legislated, and there's no chance in hell, of course, that it will be, but if it were to be legislated, they have a graphic that shows that in 2027, it would have actually gone down a little bit to 74.9%. So weren't they being fiscally responsible in their budget by doing something progressive, according to the way they're going to describe what they're doing, and also at the same time reducing the debt by 14 points other where it otherwise would have been. That's basically the takeaway that they want you to make from that. Okay. So then What they also did in their report was to project the deficit as a share of GDP, again from fiscal years 2016 to 2027. And according to current law, we are roughly at, we have a budget deficit of roughly 3%. I think it's perhaps a little under 3%, okay, at this point, okay, of GDP. But anyway, it's about the same size as the trade deficit, which, according to the sectoral balances, means that the private sector as a whole has no savings. In other words, it has no surplus for the year that we're talking about. If a year, okay, for an annual period where the trade deficit is 3% and the budget deficit, okay, is 3%, the net gain to the private sector is 0%, okay, of GDP in that particular year. Now, of course, it could be worse. We could have a budget deficit of 2% and a trade deficit, okay, of 3%, which would mean that the private sector would have lost 1%, okay, of GDP, would be in the process of losing 1% in this current year, 2017. Okay, so starting with 2018, the CPC starts to gradually reduce the deficit, or maybe not so gradually reduce it. It drops down to the same level as current law in 2018, according to the projection, which is roughly about 2.5%, okay, of GDP. And then it plummets in 2019, according to their projection, to what looks like on the graph to be about 0.5%, okay, of GDP. Okay, so really, really fiscally responsible, they're projecting for themselves and are really, really happy about it, this 0.5% of GDP deficit for 2019. And of course, this is completely out of context of the sectoral balances. Now, we know that in 2017, we know that we have this trade deficit, okay, of 3%. We have no idea whether we are still going to have a trade deficit of 3% in 2019. CPC has not bothered to project what the trade deficit is likely to be in 2019. But we can be almost sure that it's not going to be 0.5%, because it hasn't been 0.5% for as long as you and I are able to remember. I don't remember the last time the trade deficit was less than 0.5%. The likelihood is that even if it starts falling with a poor economy, and of course the CPC thinks its interventions in the economy would be better for the economy and would cause it to expand. But if the economy got worse, that's when the trade deficit would go down. It might fall from 3% to 2% then, or even to 1.5%. But if we really do have prosperity because of what the CPC is doing, the trade deficit's going to be higher, not lower. I mean, last time we had relatively good times during the Bush administration. I know they were not good for for many, many Americans, but there was an expansion. In other words, the 2000-2002 period, okay, was a recession. In about the 3 years following, okay, were better times until the housing crash came in 2007. So the fact is, as things got better under Bush, the trade deficit expanded. It was hitting 6 to 7% by the time of the housing crash. Okay? If the CPC were really successful in getting its budget through and cutting the deficit to 0.5%, okay, of GDP, with a trade deficit of 6%, the private sector would have a loss of 5.5% of GDP in that year. I mean, that's massive. 5% of GDP. It's massive. I mean, it's like $1 trillion, okay, coming out of the private sector because they want to run nearly a surplus, okay? So then as things go under current law, I mean, I'd rather be living under current law from a macroeconomic standpoint than their budget, because under current law, okay, the deficit gradually goes up from where it is today, and by 2019, it's a little higher than 3%, and by 2027, under current law, it's up to 5%, which might just be greater than the trade deficit in that year, might just be greater if the trade deficit hasn't expanded up to 5% itself. But according to CPC, after the 0.5%, okay, of deficits, they start rising gradually also until in 2027, they hit 3.2%, which is probably just enough to offset the trade deficit after 10 years. Well, of course, we'll never get through 10 years because if they are successful in reducing the deficits in the way they want to reduce that deficit and in the way that is assumed in their projections, then after 2 years of that success in cutting the deficits, the burden is going to be too much for the private sector to bear, and we're going to have a crash unless we have a total outrageous bubble once again blown by the Federal Reserve and the credit markets and the housing markets. I'm not excluding that. We might have that kind of nonsense anytime, okay? But of course, if that happened, then sooner or later, what goes up must come down. And if that happened with the current weak state, fragile state of the basis of the economy, it would be much worse than 2008. Much, much worse than.
I mean, these booms and bust cycles that we experience, last one was in 2008, it just seems that those who are in Congress right now, either one, they don't understand economics enough to, really fix it, or two, they're gaining something from all of these boom and bust, or they're just, this lack of understanding. What you stated was very, was very succinct and very clear. But what's not clear is like their logic and keeping on going where we had these massive booms and busts and they're getting worse.
Yeah, well, actually, their logic is based on the experience of the Clinton administration, where Bill Clinton tried to reduce the deficit, okay, as much as he could, and succeeded because the economy was booming. But everybody forgets why the economy was booming. It was because the Federal Reserve reduced the interest rates down close to nothing, made credit freely available during the latter half of the 90s, and because the venture capital world went crazy and all these startups, created a boom time. Okay. Then when the venture capital bubble burst, okay, in 1999, things started coming down, and Clinton kept the pressure on with respect to surpluses using his favorite people like Jack Lew, who was also instrumental, in the Obama administration. He serves in administration, and then he goes to Wall Street. He makes money. He comes back, serves a little bit, and he goes out and he makes money. he's a real sharp pencil guy, when it comes to public expenditures.
Right.
Anyway, so they look at that experience and they don't recognize that the recession of 2000 to 2002 was the reaction of the economy to Clinton's policies and to the venture capital crash, and also to Clinton's mistakes. And they don't attribute the crash of 2008 at all to Clinton, even though two key pieces, of legislation which facilitated this crash, specifically the Commodity Futures Act, which allowed the mushrooming of derivatives and made the international markets a gambling casino, and the repeal of Glass-Steagall, both of them passed within a very short time of each other, because Gingrich and Clinton made a deal to push them through the Congress, and these two acts were a major cause of the crash of 2008. They facilitated all of the swindles of the banksters that were the root cause of the crash. So anyway, to Democrats today, a lot of the Democrats who came into the party, Bill Clinton's presidency was a wonderful time for Democrats, as they remember it. It's viewed as if it's kind of a golden age, because most of them are too young to remember the 1960s. So anyway, they look back to Clinton and they look back to the 8 years, and they look back to unemployment going down to 3.8%, on Clinton's watch. And they give him credit for that without apportioning any blame for the critical legislation that he passed and for the pushing of surpluses when he should have been pushing expansions of the social safety net instead. Mm-hmm. Instead, he was seeking ways to privatize the social safety net. And the only reason why he didn't do it with Social Security was because of Monica Lewinsky and that affair. I don't know if you know that story.
Yeah, I know the story.
Okay, you know the story. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
After that happened, they couldn't get anything passed. That was very fortunate for us. Very fortunate.
Right.
Hey, Monica, we'll be forever grateful to you.
For stopping the privatization of Social Security.
For stopping the privatization of Social Security. Okay, so CPC also did a projection of the non-defense discretionary budget authority as a share of GDP, excluding supplemental spending, like unplanned spending, like on floods or on wars or right. Stuff like that. So that averaged historically 3.5%. So CPC, we see some of the rationale of CPC here. What it's trying to do is to lift the non-defense but discretionary spending from where it's been going up to that long-term average of 3.5% of GDP. And according to the projections that it gives, it achieves that goal in roughly 2022 and continues at roughly the 3.5% average for the rest of the period up to 2027. So it sees itself as increasing the non-discretionary budget spending on social programs, basically, and infrastructure programs and other good things. steadily, if its program were passed, from 2017 onward. Okay. Now, comparing that, there's a little data in their projection on the president's budget. For some reason, they project that only out for 1 year, probably because at the time he had only this skinny budget out, the skeletal budget.
Right.
But by 2018, that spending was going to fall under his budget to 2.32% rather than going up. Okay, starting from a baseline of roughly 2.6%. Okay, it was going to fall to 2.32% under his budget. Under current law, it would have fallen also, though. It would have fallen to 2.6% from that 2.7%, and it would have continued falling, according to their projection, to 2.30%, from 2.6 to 2.30% over the period through 2027. So by 2027, it would be 1.2% below the historical average, whereas according to CPC, if their budget were followed, if it were possible to follow it, then they would have the spending up to 3.5%. And of course, they consider that to be a very good result. It's a wonder how used these people are to celebrating small beer.
Yeah, it seems like these small
or is it weak tea?
I know weak tea. They seem to love this weak tea, and they seem to relish in these small victories, which really doesn't do anything for people who are really in need, and our population, our infrastructure is really in need of some love, basically. And Congress has the power to make it happen, but they seem to want to settle for these small victories that you're talking about.
Now, I agree completely. CPC and EPI have, of course, deficit and debt projections going out to 2027. They also have GDP projections. I don't know, I'm not sure which model they used for their GDP projections, but over the 10 years, they have us growing by roughly 50%. And since growth from year to year, is cumulative, that's actually a very low rate, of economic growth of the budget. I'm sorry, of the GDP. So they're not projecting that the effects of their budget are going to explode the economy or anything like that. Far from it. Mm-hmm. They're staying with the very conservative GDP projections, which we're getting from CBO, which always seems to assume a stagnant economy, of one kind or another. Anyway, CPC sees the debt held by the public going up from 14.2 trillion in 2016 to 20 trillion 926 million in 2027, less than a 50% rise in the debt. Okay. Now, the reason why the debt is not at 20 trillion now, you've probably heard the figure of 20 trillion for debt constantly offered. What the CPC people are doing here is they're looking at the debt held by the public, not the debt the Treasury owes to other agencies of the federal government, like, for example, Social Security, okay, or Medicare. Okay, in other words, the money that it owes to the so-called trust funds. So the difference between the 20 million and the 14 million is accounted for by that. Okay, so the 14 million is a correct figure. There are many people who think that it's the figure that actually should be used in citing the totals, okay, of debt, because they think that for the economy, the internal debt of the federal government, one pocket of the federal government to another pocket, okay, of the federal government, isn't significant for the economy because it doesn't go into the economy. It just shifted from one federal agency to another. Okay, so the real important figure here is their prediction that there will be less than a 50% rise in the total debt. And this is enough so that the ratio of debt to GDP in their projections actually goes down. As I said earlier, it goes down from 77% in 2016 to that 74.9% in 2027, okay, according to their projections. So to them, that makes them fiscally responsible. Okay, so again, the macroeconomic sectoral transaction model says that when you look at things as a percent, okay, of GDP, because that's the convenient way, okay, of doing it, that the percent, okay, of GDP of the government sector plus the percent, okay, of GDP. The percent of the domestic non-government sector, okay, plus the percent going to the foreign sector, okay, is equal to 0. Okay, and this relates to whether the sectors in the process of exchange, okay, among the sectors are running a surplus or a deficit. Okay, so for example, if you want the domestic non-government sector to run a surplus of, let's say, 4%, and you've have a foreign sector which is getting more, okay, dollars than it is sending back to the United States by 4%, okay, of GDP, then since the equation must be equal to 0 always over any time period, okay, it must be the case that the government sector will be running a deficit, okay, of 8%. Now, if the government sector isn't running a deficit of 8%, because the government is forcing a lower deficit through its activist deficit reduction attempts. So, for example, okay, let's say it decides to run only 3% and it sticks with that, okay, for the whole year, then there's a shortfall of 5% from the original assumptions. And that loss of 5% of GDP has to be apportioned between the foreign sector and the domestic non-government sector. So let's say the foreign sector takes 2% of GDP less, okay? Then to get to 0, the private sector here, or the domestic non-government sector, has to have a loss for the year of 3%, okay, of GDP. 3% of net financial assets, not 3% of money necessarily, because the Federal Reserve controls the amount of money. Okay, that's in the private banking system, also controls the flow of money in the system. But the flow of net financial assets is subject to fiscal control. And if the federal government decides to run a deficit of only 3%, and we choose to buy from the foreign sector to the tune of a deficit of 3%, then it's going to be the case that there will be no savings for the private sector at all. So when the government sector decides to cut back the deficit and not allow it to float, but to force a smaller deficit, the consequence of that is going to be that the private sector in our present world system right now is that the private sector will take a bigger hit than the foreign sector takes.
Is that
the private sector will experience a loss?
Is that the reason why in our current state that to open a business, to get a loan to open a business is really tough for graduates out of college to find the job that's going to carry them into the future is very tough. There's absolutely no, currency flow in our domestic markets. It is, and you could feel it, and people do talk about it, and they're talking about it in the streets, how it's very difficult, and they're afraid of they don't really understand that their federal taxes don't fund the spending, but they're still talking about being overly taxed because their states are broke. And the trickles all the way down to the local level. Is that what we're experiencing because we're buying these imports and our currency or our money is going overseas? Am I correct?
Not entirely.
Okay.
Okay, because it's not a matter of money per se. It's a matter of net financial assets, because when the net financial assets are getting generated, then the money can always be generated through lending. Okay. Also, the money can be made available, as it was in the past, by a banking system that wants to take risks. During the boom times, in the 1990s, the banking system wanted to take risks. And it made credit very, very easily available. And it didn't really matter that the private sector was beginning to experience these transactional losses, because from the account, not from the macroeconomic accounting point of view, but from the accounting point of view for each of the individual businesses involved, because the money was flowing so freely and the venture capital was flowing so freely, and the housing market was so active as a result of all this, the paper value of the assets of people and companies was shooting up during this period of time. So it looked like prosperity. But these were financial assets that were not based on high-powered money, federal spending. They were financial assets based on bank money. And if the banks got into trouble, the bubble could burst and that money could disappear in a very, very short time, as it did in 2008. Okay, that's why we had such a major crash in 2008. Now, we had a recovery. One of the reasons why we had a recovery was that because of the stimulus bill, okay, and the lack of tax revenues because the economy was so far down, there developed a very high budget deficit during the early years of the Obama administration. If you look at the sectoral balances, you can see that the budget deficit was very high during that period of time. It approached 10%, I think. I don't think it went over 10%, but it was damn close. Okay. And it stayed high, like 9%, 8%, 6%. There was a gradual reduction in the budget deficit. But for those years, it was heavy enough to overcome the trade deficit and to leave money in the hands of the private sector in the aggregate. So people could, the asset markets could begin to recover because of that particular dynamic. But along about 2014, in part as a result of the fiscal cliff and the partial recovery that we were having, things began to get close in terms of the financial, the sectoral balances. The trade deficits began to get close to the budget deficits, and Obama kept pushing the budget deficits down for Obama and the Republican Congress. In other words, they were the two of them, essentially exchanging back and forth with this Peterson model of austerity in mind, okay, to basically continue to reduce the deficits. They argued about what to spend on, but basically they were in agreement those deficits had to go down because there was this horrendous long-term debt problem that, of course, according to MMT, doesn't mean a goddamn thing.
Right.
Even less than the deficit. Okay, than what the deficit means. It means zilch for a monetary sovereign. But there they are, all frantic over the debt. Okay, and Peterson feeds this every year with his, fiscal summit meetings, where all the Congress people dutifully go. The leaders of Congress, they dutifully go and they repeat the mantra. Okay, of Peterson. Everybody agrees about what a horrendous debt problem we have. But anyway, as this came closer to balance, there was a drag on the economy. That's what accounts for the fact that it took so long for the economy to recover. From other crashes that we had, lesser recessions since the 1970s, each recovery has been longer than the last. And the reason for that has been that at the beginning of this process, we had substantial trade surpluses. So we didn't need to have budget deficits that were that high for the private sector to be gaining. Okay. With the 1980s, that started changing somewhat. The trade deficits became larger relative to the budget deficits. Well, no, actually, the budget deficits were still large because of Reagan's tax cuts. But then came the economy drive in the last part of Reagan's presidency, okay, and in the Bush presidency, and then that caused the recession of the early 90s, and then Clinton came in. Okay, with what we've already said. So then when we next had the 2002 recession, it took us from 2000 to 2002, took us 2 years to get out of that recession. And then we had war expenditures to help us out. But when things crashed in 2007, 2008, we had these huge trade deficits, and the private sector had been losing money year after year for a number of years. Actually, if you take into account the Clinton surplus years and the Bush years, when he was in the presidency, I think there was only 1 year where the private sector as a whole was running a surplus. So year after year, they were not getting a surplus of hard money net financial assets. All the assets that were being built up were paper assets coming from the use of bank money. And that's what caused the crash. In other words, all that went away overnight, and the banks had to be bailed out by the federal government, and the bubble had to be reblown. But things really didn't change in any fundamental way because the Obama administration was running the same kinds of policies as the Clinton administration. All it really did was to reblow the bubble. Okay.
Well, he did bring in Larry Summers. He brought in Larry Summers and into his administration, Obama, who was there during the Clinton years, so it's sort of the same.
Well,
the same play.
Larry Summers was brought in. Also, Rahm Emanuel was brought in. Peter Orszag was brought in by Obama. Jack Lew was also brought in by Obama. His whole economic team, the majority of them came from the Clinton administration, and they were the ones who were in control. And when Summers left, the Obama administration, who should show up to take Summers' place? Well, the guy who took his place during the 90s, Gene Sperling. He showed up. And he started filling his shoes. Okay? And whose place did Jack Lew take? Jack Lew, in the latter part of the Clinton administration, was the OMB director. But he filled somebody else's shoes then in the Clinton administration, and I forget who it was, but he was very good at the sharp pencil stuff too. But Lew was terrific. No one is the equal of Lew at juggling those numbers to reduce the deficit. Okay, and Obama brought him in when Orszag decided that he wanted to leave. And he did the same thing for Obama, steadily driving the deficit down, steadily imposing a further fiscal drag on the economy, in addition to the fiscal cliff. Okay, so that's why it's taking so long to recover, and that's why the recovery is so soft. We now have, and we now see, the projections, the unemployment rates, which appear to be very low, now approaching 4%, which is almost as good as Clinton got. But now it's a little different from what happened during the Clinton administration because there are so many people who are in the U6 unemployed category now, far more than there were during the Clinton administration. And then there's yet another category of people who have officially left the labor force and who we don't even count as part of it. And, if you estimate how many those are, we don't need 3 or 4 million new jobs now, which is what the CPC is saying. They're saying, we can get 3 or 4 million new jobs with our budget, and then we'd be at full employment. That's BS. We need 20 million jobs to really fulfill a demand that is out there. Right. All you have to do to see that is to notice that during the depth of the Depression, we needed upwards of 30 million jobs at that time. Well, how many jobs did the Obama administration actually generate? What was it, 13 million in the end or something like that?
Right.
And the population has grown since then. So we got 20 million people out there who would be taking full-time jobs at a living wage if they could get it. 20 million additional people who could be employed for infrastructure projects or for green innovation. We're just wasting resources up the anus. We're doing that. So we look at the CPC budget from the macro point of view, not going into any details of the specific spending. And from the macro point of view, it looks like, ugh, it sucks. Because the private sector is likely to experience these aggregate losses year after year until finally the bankers back off. Okay, and we get a collapse. Now, right now, the bankers are not backing off. They're trying to blow a credit bubble again. We're getting credit cards in the mail all the time. I mean, we don't want any additional credit cards right now.
Absolutely.
Okay? We don't want to have anything to do with that. Right. And they're sending credit cards every goddamn week. So that's exactly what was happening in 2007, 2008. They're trying to play this, musical chairs game again. Okay. So this budget at a macro level is leaving a world of policy space on the table compared to a full employment economy. How much? In 2018, if we ran a deficit of 10%, which would provide healthy savings for the private sector and a healthy ability to purchase from our neighbors, to run trade deficits, with our neighbors, there would be 1.47 trillion in additional policy space that we would not use in the CPC budget. In other words, if the CPC ran a real full employment, stable economy budget, it would have an additional policy space of $1.47 trillion in 2018. In 2019, this amounts to $1.93 trillion. In 2020, it's $1.88 trillion. This is using their figures, okay? In 2021, it's $1.98 trillion. In 2022, well, you get the idea. It's in the range of $1.88 to $1.87 trillion each year. The total for 10 years is $18.7 trillion over 10 years. Now, assuming a fiscal multiplier, actually primary fiscal multipliers, secondary fiscal multipliers, and tertiary fiscal multipliers, because the net financial assets in the economy the government puts in circulate a number of times, and each time there's a multiplier effect that goes through circulation. With a multiplier of 2.0, which, believe me, is conservative. I mean, Bill Mitchell might calculate it at 3.0, because for certain expenditures it is 3.0. But with a multiplier of 2.0, that is a difference of $37.4 trillion in GDP foregone by the CPC budget. And that doesn't speak to the issue of all of the unemployment that will continue to come back and continue to plague us, and all the ruined lives resulting from the stuff we will not spend on because the CPC is playing this austerity game with the Petersonians and these other idiots every year, instead of getting on its hind legs and saying to these people, look, this is all bullshit. What you're doing is bullshit. Here are the things the American people need. We can afford it. We're a monetary sovereign, and we're going to go out there and we're going to get it now. Okay? And if you don't like it, we're going to defeat you come the next election. Maybe it'll take us one election or two elections or three elections, but we're going to put it out there. We're not going to put out there this crappy little weak tea thing. okay, that we're doing. And we're going to end up getting this additional $37.4 trillion for the U.S. economy and all the safety net things and climate change things and other great things like the free education at every level and paid family leave and all the other things that Americans ought to have that are the rights of Americans. We're going to get those things.
Right.
Okay. So let's now dig into the micro austerity aspect of it by looking at what the CPC wants to spend on. Well, it has a chart, CPC does, in its report of the functional budget increases relative to current law for fiscal 2018 to fiscal year 2027. The first function, 050, is national defense. There is an increase built into the CPC budget for that, but it's not large enough to mention, evidently. It has to do with the Office of Economic Adjustment, with congressional directed medical research programs that are related to defense, and also to a strategic sustainability performance plan. They want to put in some funds for strategic sustainability performance related to national defense. Then there's Function 150, which is the international affairs budget. They want to increase this by $63 billion over 10 years. That's $6.3 billion per year. Out of a budget approaching $4 trillion each year. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Now, that's not for defense spending. That comes under another category. As I already said, they don't have any increases scheduled for that. But their increase for international affairs in general is really weak tea. This is for refugee programs, for smart security, for the U.S. Institute of Peace, for the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, for the HIV/AIDS international programs, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, USAID and the humanitarian assistance, for microfinance, for child survival and health programs, for the Peace Corps, and for reconstruction assistance. That's all. An average increase of $6.3 billion per year. Then, Function 250, General Science, Space, and Technology. That's a little larger. That's $92 billion, or $9.3 billion per year. Again, I say big deal. This is for the National Science Foundation, for NASA, for Science, Aeronautics, and Technology, for manufacturing research, for clean energy technologies research. Clean energy technologies research, only a share of $9.2 billion per year? That's ridiculous. I mean, that figure should be astronomical. STEM, education research, science, technology, engineering, and what, I forget what the M is. Oh, and mathematics.
Right.
Education research, all of that for the $92 billion increase on $9.2 billion per year. Again, off the top of our heads, not nearly enough. And there's $1.47 trillion going begging there that they won't spend, and because they won't spend it, or asked to spend it, at least, we're going to have less employment, a less active economy, a more stagnant economy. So, what's the next one? Well, it's energy. That, at least, represents a substantial increase, but as we'll see, still far from what's needed. That's $593 billion. Sounds like a lot. Okay, but it's over 10 years. So again, it's only $60 billion a year. That's for renewable energy technology and deployment, the Energy Innovation Fund, geothermal technology, for weatherization and intergovernmental activities, and for ARPA's work in the energy area. Okay. Now, again, that is really a ridiculously small figure for these very, very important areas, okay, of expenditure.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, here's Function 300, which is a natural resources area. That includes Indian affairs, reestablishment of the CCC, natural resources conservation services, and the environment. That some more things included there: wetlands reserve program, conservation stewardship program, land and water conservation fund, multinational species conservation, harbor maintenance trust fund, secure rural schools and community self-determination act, supporting climate resilience in Indian country, and payments in lieu of taxes. So that's an increase of $433 billion, or $43 billion a year. Okay. Again, I mean, shit, that's for the environment. Only $43 billion a year. It's not just for the environment; it's for all these other things too. But the environment is included in there. I mean, this is a grand increase over what the Republicans are going to do, of course. So what Trump wants to do, he wants to just cut this down to zero. At least they want to increase it. But, I mean, they're really asking for zilch. Why? Because they want to be reasonable. They want to show they're responsible. They want to show they're adults. Their job is not to show that they're adults. Their job right now, they're out of power. They can't vote in anything. They can't get anything. So there's no question of feasibility involved. What they need to do is go out there with what they think is necessary to solve the problems of America. Don't compromise a dollar, no matter what it costs. Put those programs in that are going to get us the answers and are going to get us results, and tell people that. That's what this is for. And tell people also, these other people, they don't want results. All they want to do is pay off the rich people and the corporations. We want results. That's why we're the CPC, because we want results and we want to legislate for public purpose. And these are the programs that will fulfill public purpose, not this set of junk here. Then they have Function 350, agriculture, a Community Connect grant program, agriculture. That's all they have an increase for listed, and they don't even have any dollars here.
Wow.
It's too small to include.
Wow.
I mean, it must be some token like $500 million or something. It doesn't even merit giving the figure. Function 370, commerce and housing credit, an increase of $93 billion, $9.3 billion per year. Okay. Always keep in mind, there's $1.47 trillion begging, even holding constant the expenditures they're making now, which a lot of this stuff would actually replace. Right. But they could spend 1.417 more per year, and all this stuff, it's just going begging. Commerce and housing credit, $93 billion. For National Network for Manufacturing Innovation, Homeless Assistance Grant, Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, Small Business Association and Business Loan Programs, National Veterans Administration, Entrepreneurship Training, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, all for $9.3 billion a year, or $93 billion. I mean, don't make me laugh. Function 400, okay? An increase of $908 billion included in the infrastructure stimulus that they want to pass. highways and bridges, mass transit, aviation, transportation, investment, generating economic recovery. Their Tiger program. See how catchy that is. Their Tiger program. Well, that's 90.8 billion per year included in their infrastructure program. The infrastructure program over 10 years is going to be 2 trillion, which is 200 billion per year. The $2 trillion, matches with what the latest scorecard is showing from the American Society for Civil Engineers in the following way. The civil engineers estimate is 4.6 trillion. The CPC's estimate is 2 trillion. Less than half the amount needed to fix the infrastructure. Okay?
That's wow.
Function 450, community and regional development. That's an increase of 96 billion or 9.6 billion on the average per year. Community development block grants, CDBG, community development fund, community development financial institutions, home investment partnerships, the Power Plus program, and rural broadband deployment. They want to do all of that for 9.6 billion per year. Again, you can't do that and do the job. Okay. Education. Well, they got a big amount they're going to devote to that. $960 billion in increase, or 96 billion per year. And that's for the wages and hours division, for the ESEA, which is the Elementary Secondary something association, IDEA, I've forgotten what that stands for, a dropout prevention program, Head Start, adult employment and training activities, the TRIO. By the way, I once did some work on the TRIO program and also the Head Start program.
Mm-hmm.
National Endowment for the Arts, home and community-based supportive services. And, okay, you thought I was finished, but I'm not. That's for youth summer jobs, for Pell Grants, including interest rate protection, apprenticeship training fund, senior community service employment program, green jobs innovation fund, national endowment for the humanities, social services block grants, on-the-job training, early learning challenge fund, dislocated workers program, public telecommunications facilities program, library services, and technology workforce investment act. So that seems like a lot of money. $960 billion, 96 billion a year. But when you list all these programs, you see that this is really, again, just a fraction of what is needed over that period of time. Okay. Again, you have to match the 96 billion per year against the 1.47 trillion of policy space that exists. By the way, that might not be all the policy space. In truth, we don't know what happens when, as you move through the year, you start doing deficit spending to match the leakage to the foreign sector and to savings. Okay? As we're trying to do that, we may find we have more than 1.7 policy space in a different year. Also, as we expand the GDP, we're looking at percents of GDP here. So even within a given year, as we're growing and expanding the GDP and as the multiplier effect is taking effect, we'll have more policy space. That could turn out to be $1.6 trillion in the first year, even. I can't say, but that's a possibility. So function 550, an increase of 299 billion. Okay? You won't believe what's included here. 299 billion over 10 years is 30 billion a year. Okay, that's supposed to include National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Aging, domestic HIV/AIDS, also maternal health, enhanced federal medical assistance percentages, community services block grants, not community development block grants, community services block grants, two different things. The mentoring of children of prisoners, community health centers. If we had a Medicare for All program, we wouldn't need community health centers.
Right.
National Health Service Corps, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Title VII programs, Title X programs. I'm not certain what those are, to be honest. National Diabetes Prevention Budget for All, Nursing Workforce Development Programs, National Institutes of Health. I don't know why they're listed here twice. The Division of Viral Hepatitis, Community Health Centers. Oh, they're listed again there too. I don't know why. National Health Services Corps. Well, evidently they've repeated a number of these things. They must have had some typos in printing this up. Teaching Health Center, GME. Not sure what that is. And Minority AIDS Initiative. Okay, Function 700. We're beginning to get close to the end here. I assure you. I think it's valuable to go through all these things. And
absolutely. Very valuable. Very valuable.
Okay. So, Function 700 is expenditures on veterans and military families. And veterans benefits and services, that includes veterans benefits and services. And there they want an increase of 216 billion or 21.6 billion per year, which of course is much more generous than anything that Trump or the Republicans are putting forward. That's supposed to cover the Wounded Warriors Canine Corps, the VA Medical and Prosthetic Research Program, Veterans Employment and Training Program, Veterans Housing Benefit Program, Homeless Veterans Program, Veterans Graduate Medical Education, and Veterans Mental Health Programs, all very worthwhile programs. Of course, the Veterans Employment and Training Program and the Veterans Housing Benefit Program would probably not be needed if we had a federal job guarantee at a living wage, along with Medicare for All, not only for veterans but for everybody. When veterans came home, they wouldn't be homeless because they'd have a living wage,
right.
And they'd also have a job with a lot of on-the-job training, paying a living wage, okay, and doing work they liked that they helped to design and which would use the skills they learned in the military. So, a lot of the things spent on here wouldn't have to be spent if we passed a federal job guarantee program, which, by the way, is nowhere in evidence in this set of programs coming from the CPC. Neither is Medicare for All in evidence. Okay, neither of those two things have we seen here. So now, the administration of justice. Increased budget increases for the administration of justice, $93 billion or $9.3 billion per year. State and local law enforcement assistance, strikes me they don't need any more law enforcement assistance than they have. They already have too much assistance enabling them to kill people. And juvenile justice, Department of Justice Administration Review and Appeals, violent crime reduction programs. Oh, you mean like the federal job guarantee? That would be a really good program for violent crime reduction.
That would work.
Juvenile justice programs, violence against women prevention and prosecution programs, persecution also, education, training, and services to end violence against and abuse of women with disabilities, burn justice assistance grants, legal services corporation, missing Alzheimer's patient alert program, and then there's also an item, end funding for family detention centers and eliminate bed mandates. That sounds like a good thing to do. I don't know why it would cost any additional money to do it, but anyway, it's an increase of $9.3 billion per year for that. Once again, seems far too little for the weight that they propose has to be carried here. Of course, a lot of this weight could be made redundant by passing the right programs for employment and for medical care in the first place. Then there's Function 800, which adds the Office of Technology Assessment back into the federal government, which I personally have sorely missed. That was a very good thing the Republicans killed when they took over Congress in 1994. Right. They didn't want any technology impact assessments to interfere with the free market. Okay. Yeah. So those are the programs they want to increase. Now, there's no mention here. It seems clear there's a big shortfall in relation to reinventing our energy foundations. The amount allocated for anything like that is absolutely minuscule. One of my colleagues at NEP, whose name is Michael Hexter, wrote up in a few blogs a plan for developing fossil fuel-free energy resources and environmental protection, which was going to cost trillions of dollars each year in additional spending. It would replace some of the spending we're doing now, but it was going to be massive and would itself create full employment. And if you read what he has to say there, the plan makes perfect sense. It's really a great job. And it just absolutely dwarfs anything they have here. As I've said, there's no guaranteed full employment program in the living wage. It falls short on entitlements, on enhancing Social Security, okay, and also Medicare. There's no Medicare for all here, as I mentioned. There's a big infrastructure shortfall, for God's sake. Even there's a big shortfall. And there's no free education at all levels. There's some free education in here, okay, but it's not at all levels. It doesn't do it. There's no debt jubilee for students. That's not in here. Okay? There are all manner of things we need that are not in this program, and there's $1.7 trillion per year at least of policy space that these people are not filling, going begging. So what their program is doing is it's providing macroeconomic austerity, which is translated into microeconomic austerity still. Maybe not compared to Paul Ryan's budget, maybe not compared to Donald Trump's budget, maybe not compared to what Peter G. Peterson would do and his think tanks would do, but compared to what we need, this is still microeconomic austerity. So this is not a progressive budget. Somebody has to tell the CPC that whatever they label it, whatever they call it, whatever propaganda they have behind it, it is not a progressive budget. It is weak tea. It doesn't make use of the policy space that's there. It doesn't make use of the monetary sovereignty of the United States. It doesn't put forward systematic, comprehensive plans for getting us out of all the various fixes we're in and solving all the problems that we're confronting right now. That has to be the task and the job of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. It has to hold out that kind of model to the rest of the political system and run on the damn thing.
Absolutely.
Inside the Democratic Party or outside the Democratic Party. It has to run on the damn thing. And it has to create in complex adaptive systems, it has to create a strange attractor that pulls and draws people in and that gets something new emerging as a political force. And all they're doing with this weak tea is basically saying, yes, but to the Austerians. Let's have a little bit more of this and let's have a little bit more of that. And we could be happy because it's a little progress towards something better. No, it's not a little progress towards something better because the opportunity cost of that kind of bullshit is too high. You have to go out there and you have to ask for what we need. You have to fight for what we need, and you have to punish people who won't do the same. And unless you can do those things, you're not going to be successful, and you're not going to do what we need to have done. So we're going to have to do it for ourselves. Now, what I would like, I'm going to make an appeal now.
Yes.
I would like our people, our real progressive people, to study this stuff, study the budgets, and learn where they are inadequate, and go at the congressman from that point of view at every town hall, in letter writing campaigns, in telephone campaigns, in every way, telling them, don't be polite, telling them, I know you think you've got a progressive budget and that you're all progressives. I say you don't know what the term means. You're not progressive and your budget is not progressive, and we're not going to let you get away with calling it progressive anymore. We're the progressives. Mm-hmm. You're the sellouts. You've got to stop selling out. And you got to put forward what the country needs. And you got to stop asking yourself, is it practical? Is it feasible? Could I make a deal right now for some of this? Bullshit. Absolutely. Your job is to get enough of a movement going to take over the whole government, the House, the Senate, the presidency, the state houses, all across the country. Everything with people who will implement a real progressive program and not this crap. Even Bernie is too far to the right for what we need right now.
Absolutely. And where do real progressives find these budgets to study? Where can they find them?
Where can they find the budgets?
The budgets to look over.
Okay. All you have to do is go to congress.gov. Okay, and then go to Grijalva, Grijalva, dash the CPC, and he's got a budget there, or just go to Grijalva's page, and you'll be able to get to the CPC budget. Because he's basically been managing, the CPC budget effort forever. Oh, and by the way, he's a really, really good guy. There's no question about that. Grijalva has been loyal and also diligent, but his problem is he's caught this practicality bug. Let's be realistic. Right. We can't get what we really need right now. So we got to nibble at the edges. We got to get him out of that. Absolutely. We got to get him eating fire again.
I like that. Study the budgets. We need to find these budgets. We need to go to congress.gov, look for the CPC, find the budget, study it, see who's on the board, see who's in this caucus, and really lay into them and say that they're not being progressive with the budget. They're actually being a little easy on the system here. They need to have a more robust budget so the people of America can have a Green New Deal, and that's reasonable. So we should all do that together. I'm definitely going to do that myself.
They need to hold that out so they can communicate to people what it is we really need, so they can give people something to organize around. I mean, people are not going to organize around this, what they just offered. I mean, people are not going to say, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. They need to put forward a budget that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Don't worry about the fact the Republicans will never pass it, because they're never going to pass this crap either. It's too liberal for them. I mean, Paul Ryan is too liberal for them.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, so what the hell? You put forward what we need and what we want, and we try to get people behind us so those other idiots don't get elected anymore. That's the objective. The objective is to move the whole system to the left.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to take some force.
Now
that's going to take some force, and you know, it's the whole saying, "Go big or go home." You know, if you're not going to push, step out of the way. This is something that we're going to have to do.
And this is an area where that applies. It is go big or go home. Okay, and not because if you go big that you're going to deliver something in the next 6 months or 3 months or even a year or 2 years. But you got to go big and keep going big. So you move the system. So you talk about it. So you explain to people why they need it. That's why you got to go big. They don't understand that. They've lost that feeling.
And we have to shock it back into them and say, this is what we want. This is what we're going to do. And this is the way that we have to go.
Yeah, and we're going to do it whether you want to or not. You can join us if you want and represent us if you want. Okay? But if you don't want, you're out of here, Buster.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Joe. So tonight was a pleasure. It's a lot of information, but there's a lot of valuable information. I really appreciate the time you take to really let us know on how to move forward. And I believe that, you know, going for the CPC in the Congress, looking into their budget, finding out that it's not progressive enough for what we need, and letting them know that we're going to go forward with the budget that we want, and we're going to run against them, and we're going to get into Congress and do what we need to do for the American people.
That's what I think. That's what I think we got to do.
Absolutely. Joe, it was a pleasure.
Otherwise, this whole world is going to hell.
And that's what we don't want. We're not going to let it happen.
We got a whole world to save, and we're not doing it right now. It's going to hell.
And we can't let it continue. We have to do whatever we can. And it's a lot of work, but you know what? That's why we're here. That's why we're here.
It is.
Joseph Firestone, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you, John.
All right, until next time.
Okay, thanks for standing in to Steve. It was a pleasure.
Oh, it was a pleasure, and I was glad to do it. And hopefully we get to meet again, and we'll talk about this budget in detail in the future.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, take care.
Take care. And everyone, thanks for hanging in there. There's a lot of information, but please, I implore you to go to congress.gov and look up where the direction that Joe Firestone has given us, and we will move forward with this and keep going. You have a good and great Saturday night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, we're no longer public now, right?
Are we on? We're still on the air.
Oh, okay.
All right. And everybody, we're still on because the program is malfunctioning. I will see you later. Joe, we'll just get off.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.